The court lived with the sum of normal expectations, papers where lawyers whispered in steamed tones, and the distant noise of another room. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat on the bench, her eyes steadily and professionally. It was another day, and at least another case, she thought. The enforcement officer called the incident Louisiana against James Anderson. Eleanor moved slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oaks of the bank. She saw her previous papers, including attacks, robbery, and resistance to arrest. A familiar pain of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul was involved in the system, she thought. Her world took care of her when the accused was brought. The man standing in front of her, captivated by her wrists and ankles, was no stranger. He was James Anderson, her James. Her neck was pulled out as a flood of memories was attacked forward. On a summer afternoon, she raced her bike on the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. Late conversation under the magnolia tree in your garden. The promises you make as a child are always on the back of others no matter what happens. But the man standing in front of her was not the boy she remembered. His shoulders were bent and he needed his face for years. But his eyes were unmistakable. These deep, soulful eyes. Eleanor's grabbed the hammer. She hesitated for the first time in her career. The room appeared to be contracting, and the walls were pushed in as they tried to deal with the impossible. James looked up at his expression of a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly turned his eyes away, his head hooded slightly. The court was waiting. Eleanor spoke to herself. "Anderson, you can use it for assault and robbery. How would you defend it?" James's voice was barely recognized. "I'm not innocent, Your Honor." Your heart beating. She wanted to stop everything. She wanted an answer. What happened to him? How has your path been dramatically broken down? However, her role as a judge called for quiet. "Continue," she said, her voice standing the magician as she felt it. Eleanor's thoughts are racing when the prosecutor begins her opening statement. This was not a case. This was James. And somehow she had to find out how she could separate her past from her present before it was too late. The court blended Eleanor's spirit as it drifted in front of her black, and a hammer floating in his hand at once. She and James grew up on the opposite page of Hammond, Louisiana, through the unspoken rules of independent cities, not distance. Her family home was a modest, one-story strike fence, but James's family lived in a weathered house on the edge of a dirt road surrounded by fields. Her friendship was extraordinary. She recalled how she met a random encounter at the edge of a stream, far from her garden. James fished, and his line got involved. She offered to help, and this simple gesture shared her secret adventures and dreams over the years. "Eleanor," he once said, next to her under the star, "how is it really coming out? When we go somewhere, don't people look at us funny just to sit together?" Then she laughed and wiped out the ideas. But James didn't joke. Even as a child, he didn't always make a room for people like him. Because of the world, because of places, he didn't always make rooms. I saw it. Their binding powers grew despite the whispers, the gaze of the sides and the direct disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there. And one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school that Eleanor's father sat on the veranda together. His voice was cold, authoritative, and sharp. "Eleanor, come in." "Now." She hesitated and looked at the frozen James. "Stay it," he said quietly. His voice colored before he resigned. "See you?" But they never saw each other again. Her father banned her from walking near James, and soon afterwards, James's family left. Eleanor threw himself into the school, and they carried their ambitions far beyond the city of Hammond. She went to legal faculty and persecuted her dreams of justice and equity. But she never forgot the boy who taught her. Now she was sitting on the bench and wondered what happened to James after going to this house and closing the door to friendship. His recordings showed many arrests for small thefts, nothing to scream. But how much can you see in a few lines of rap leaves? The prosecutor's voice grabbed her into the present. He explained the alleged crime. James was accused of attacking a store employee while robbing a supermarket in Baton Rouge. The employee was slightly injured and the cash register was empty. A few blocks have been removed for James. Eleanor studied James when the prosecutor spoke. His attitude faded, his hands covered in front of him, but his expression was indecipherable. Did he really do that? Or have you talked about more than the prosecutors claimed? The court was ongoing for lunch break and gave Eleanor a little to gather her ideas. When she returned to her room, her assistant Margaret approached with hesitation. "Judge Hayes, are you doing?" "They seemed a little distracted," Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated. Should she entrust Margaret? Wouldn't it be an expert to admit that she knew the accused? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine. A lot in my head. But she wasn't good. What about her when her past, which she buried so deeply, was only a few meters away waiting for her judgment?" The court was packed when the attempt resumed. The prosecutor, a keen man named Richard Powell, was ready to tell his case. "Jew umpire women and gentlemen," Powell started his voice company. "The incident is about violence. A whale entered a convenience store and attacked with an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register without provocation. The evidence shows James Anderson of this crime. It shows that he is guilty." Eleanor felt the knot in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical and distant, as if James was nothing more than a docket name. She looked at James, her gaze still remaining on the table in front of him. Defender Lisa Porter was founded to declare her opening. She was young, but confident, with a voice that was beyond the room. "Prosecutors will make them believe that this case is not complicated. My client, James Anderson, has retained his innocence from the start. This story gives more and shows that the assumptions are not considered on the night of arrest." The first witness was called to an employee at the store where he worked on the night of the incident. He described the man who came to the store with the cashier and jumped over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something was rehearsed. Lisa's cross-life was surgical. "Mr. Chambers, you explained that the man who attacked the employee was wearing a red hoodie. Is that so?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark and he had the hood." Lisa nodded, going up and down a little. "So you say you can definitely identify the person who committed the attack?" "Well, no." "There's no further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off. Eleanor noticed James change slightly in his seat, fighting over his shoulder as if the exchange had given him a little thought of hope. The following evidence was surveillance video from the store. The film was made from grain and was not illuminated, and I saw a red hoodie in the store. Prosecutors claimed that the person was at Video James, but the quality made it difficult to recognize all the discriminators. Once the video was played, Eleanor studied it carefully. Is it really James? The numbers quickly moved and disappeared off the screen after arriving at the counter. The film's material suddenly ended, leaving an ominous gap in the story. James's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he returned home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. However, my friend was not prepared to testify to the fear of retaliation from the community and quoted it. Lisa argued that the lack of ambitious witness James did not deny innocence but that the Jew-described expression showed skepticism. As the attempt continued, Eleanor felt the weight of her position. She should be a fair and impartial pillar, but what about her when she reminds her of her childhood? The boy who was once her best friend was now the man who fought his freedom, and she was the person who was asked to determine his destiny. When the court postponed the day, Eleanor stayed on the bench, her fingers persecuting the edge of the hammer. She wanted to talk to James and ask directly what happened, but she knew she couldn't. All contact outside the court will put the case and career at risk. Eleanor's resolve fluctuated when she saw the way James accompanied bonding from the room. She always believed in a judicial system that revealed the truth. But for the first time, she wondered whether the truth was truly something to grasp. The court was summed up in a gentle tweet when the process reached a critical moment. It was defense to present her case, and Lisa Porter called her first and most important witness, Officer Daniel Harris, an officer. Eleanor leaned slightly, her eyes narrowing. "If you have it here, you may see a crack." Officer Harris, a sturdy man with a sturdy behavior, appeared. Lisa intentionally settled down and approached him. "Officer Harris," she began, "did they arrest my client?" "Yes," he replied, his tone cut. "You explained in your report that when you arrested him, Anderson was 2 blocks away from the scene of the robbery. Is that so?" "Yes." "And what led her to the belief that he is a suspect?" Harris moved to his seat. "He was suitable for black men who were wearing dark clothes in the mid-1940s. Lisa's eyebrows were lifted slightly. "Dark clothes?" "But the suspect in the video was described as a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Anderson's property when you searched for it?" Harris hesitated. "Number. But he could have dumped it." Lisa took a step closer. "Have you or another officer ever done a search in the area to find this supposed parka?" Harris's kiefer got stuck. "Number, we didn't have time. He was arrested soon," Lisa continued. To explain, "Did you arrest my client based on a vague explanation that has no physical evidence that is not associated with the scene?" The officer's silence spoke more eloquent than every word. Eleanor's view flicked at the Jew degree. Some members exchanged opinions. Lisa wasn't finished. "Officer Harris, do you remember when Mr. Anderson said something during his arrest?" "He protested. He said he was innocent." "And have you considered examining his claims? Or have you accepted guilt based solely on your appearance?" Harris's face has decreased. "I followed the protocol." "Protocol," Lisa repeats. Her voice gets caught up in skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." The court again summarized. When Harris resigned, he visibly shook his credibility. Eleanor's heart beat. This was not just an attempt, it was a settlement. Not just for James, but for the system that seemed eager to blame him. The next step in defense was unexpected. Lisa has announced the forensic analyst who checked the surveillance materials. Analysts said there was no final opportunity to make sure it was James because of the amount and structure of the individuals in the video. Additionally, time tempo was changed in film material and asked about its reliability. The prosecutor tried to dismiss the certificate as speculation, but the JU apprentice seemed unstable. A shadow of doubt was in the room, and Eleanor could feel his weight. When the day was over, James was given the opportunity to testify in his own name. Lisa warned him of the risk, but James insisted it. He stood up and clung softly as the chain approached the stand. His voice was calm, but she was wearing raw integrity. "I made a mistake in my life," James began to speak directly to the JU umpire. "I pulled the wrong curves and trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do that. That night I went home and looked after my business when the police stopped me. They didn't ask questions. The bill. I fought for the rest of my life, to see more than what people take over. But I'm tired. I just want the truth to play a role." Eleanor's throat got stuck as James sat back. His words hang in the air. Pleas not only for justice but for humanity. She saw the juju. Her face was a mixture of emotions, doubt, empathy, uncertainty. That's all. The truth was no longer limited to evidence or certificates. It was a battle of conscience, a battle against the weight of prejudice and acceptance. Eleanor knew that her role wasn't just to maintain the law. The final day of the experiment was difficult, as expected. The final discussion was delivered accurately. The prosecutor was evidence-based and asked the JU judge to trust the system's processes. However, Lisa advocated to the JU judge that he would look beyond the surface to take into account human cases and the holes of humanity in court. Eleanor listened carefully. Her face is not involved, but her heart runs. Her role was clear. She could not influence the Jew referee, but if her judgment on interpretation leaves the space, she will have the last words. The burden of ensuring justice was heavily emphasized. The Jew judge thought for hours. The court was emptied and filled as people spread their legs and whispered to each other. James sat quietly, his hands flowing firmly in front of him. He had not seen Eleanor since the first day of the exam, and she couldn't blame him. What can you say to make some of it better? Finally, the enforcement officer announced that the Jew court had handed down the verdict. The room was silent as she was in front of precautions and a piece of paper trembling into her hand. In the case of Louisiana against James Anderson, we find the accused. This break was unbearable. I'm not innocent. The room broke out with a mixture of gasps, mutters, and even a few cheers. Eleanor knocked on her hammer and restored her order. James's shoulders hang down as if his weight had been lifted, but his face was unreadable. He had gained freedom, but it was clear that this victory would come with costs. Eleanor turned to the courthouse where her voice was stable. The JU judge spoke. "Mr. Anderson, you can go freely. The food will be postponed." When the court was empty, Eleanor stayed behind and saw James as he signed the publication. For a while she thought he could go without a word. But he turned around and approached her. The room was almost empty. Only a few employees had cleaned up and collected Margaret's files. James stayed a few meters away from the bank and protected his expression. "You're not thinking about me," he said quietly. "But why do you want to know why you said nothing? You knew me." Eleanor felt how her neck was toned, words caught. "Because I couldn't. I had to be fair. If I had said something, it could have put the incident at risk." James studied her, and his face mixed with injury and understanding. "Fair," he repeated. "That's what it is, Eleanor. The world was never fair. Not for people like me." She nodded slowly. Her gaze fell on the refined tree of the bank. "You're right. I wish I had done more at the time. I wish I could do more now." James sighed. The tension in his attitude was easy to ease. "We were kids. We didn't know much. But you know that now, right?" "I will," Eleanor said, her voice. "And I'm sorry." James nodded weakly, turned around and left. His back straightened as he disappeared through the door of the court building. Eleanor sat alone in an empty courtroom. She checked the law, but the procedure revealed a deeper truth. Justice was not just judgment and evidence. It was about life shaped by a system that is much larger than any other person. For Eleanor, it was memory of wake-up call A that their position was not only electric seats, but also a platform for changes. When she left court that night, Eleanor was a quiet oath. She could not change the past, but she did everything with her powers, allowing her to promise more than the hollow promise of fairness. It could be difficult, but she owed to James and herself to give it a try.